The room froze the moment he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but the calm weight in his words made the CEO's crystal glass slip from his hand and shatter on the marble floor. Before we dive in, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to hit subscribe because tomorrow's story, trust me, it's going to blow your mind. The building gleamed like a monument to power, glass and steel catching the last bruised streaks of daylight as the city gave way to night. Ethan Cole pushed through the revolving doors without a sound, his janitor's badge reflecting briefly under the security lights before disappearing back into shadow. He didn't need anyone to greet him. No one ever did. He had learned long ago how to slip into spaces like water into cracks, filling them, cleaning them, but never leaving a trace of himself behind. At 41, invisibility was no longer a burden. It was survival. He wheeled his cart across the marble floor, mop handles rattling softly against plastic, the faint squeak of wheels echoing in the cavernous lobby. Above him, an LED ticker scrolled numbers most people couldn't understand, but which decided futures with merciless efficiency. Executives swept past in tailored suits, their perfumes sharp, their laughter sharper. None of them glanced at him. To them, he wasn't a man. He was background. Furniture with a heartbeat, the one who picked up the shards when their champagne glasses slipped. But Ethan's silence wasn't weakness. Beneath the Navy uniform and rubber gloves lived someone who had once carried more than a mop. Years earlier, he had worn a badge, patrolled streets that never slept, and shouldered the weight of keeping strangers alive. He'd been good at it, too. But life had a way of stripping men down, piece by piece. The badge gave way to folded flags, the folded flag gave way to a hospital bed, and the hospital bed gave way to a daughter who needed him more than anything else ever could. His wife's absence still pressed against him some nights like a hand he couldn't move away. But grief had taught him one lesson. You keep going. For Mia. Always for Mia. Every evening, when the skyscraper's heartbeat slowed and the last of the suits climbed into black cars waiting at the curb, Ethan began his shift. He started in the lobby, buffing the chrome handles until they gleamed like mirrors, sweeping dust from corners most people never noticed, wiping smudges from the glass that stood taller than houses. The work wasn't glamorous, but he did it with precision, as though the building itself deserved respect. There was dignity in clean floors, even if no one said thank you. He knew the rhythm of the place better than anyone, which doors stuck in winter, which elevators groaned between the 15th and 16th floors, which conference rooms smelled faintly of cigars after certain board members forgot the smoking policy. The building talked to him in creaks and whispers, and he listened. He always listened. To the suits upstairs, Ethan Cole was a nobody. But Mia never saw him that way. She was 14 now, old enough to sense the weight her father carried, and young enough to still believe he was invincible. She'd leave him little sketches in his lunch bag, tiny doodles of him with his mop drawn like a sword, his shoulders broad, his smile wider than the real thing ever was these days. "You're my superhero," she told him once, when he tried to brush it off. He didn't argue. He just kissed her forehead and kept working, because the truth was, she was his reason for every single overnight shift. When the clock struck midnight and the city's chaos quieted into a low hum, Ethan often paused at the top of the lobby stairs. He would lean on the mop handle, take in the echo of his own breath, and feel a strange calm settle in his chest. The tower might never remember his reflection, but he wasn't here for the building. He was here for the paycheck that kept the lights on in their small apartment, the meals warm, and Mia's laughter alive. That was enough. What Ethan didn't know, what no one knew, was that sometimes invisibility isn't permanent. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one question spoken in the wrong room at the right time, for a man the world ignored to become the only one it couldn't look away from. For now, though, he remained in the shadows, pushing his cart through the endless shine of marble and glass, a quiet strength waiting to be called upon. Mia Cole had a way of seeing the world that most people her age missed. Other 14-year-olds measured life by phone screens and group chats, their worth tied up in likes and weekend plans. Mia measured hers in the quiet details no one else cared to notice. She could tell when the apartment radiator was about to groan by the faint rattle in the pipes. She could tell when her dad was exhausted before he even took off his boots, just by the slight drag in his step across the kitchen linoleum. She could tell when he was remembering something painful because his jaw would tighten ever so slightly, like he was holding words back from the air itself. She never complained about the thrift store jeans or the casseroles reheated 3 nights in a row, not because she didn't notice, she noticed everything, but because she knew her father already carried the weight of not being able to give her more. She'd watched the way his eyes flickered with guilt when she turned down an invitation to a birthday party at an ice rink, knowing he couldn't afford skates. She'd seen him fold her hand-me-downs with such careful precision as though if he folded them perfectly enough, they might transform into something new. And she loved him too much to let him think she cared about any of it. While her classmates filled their weekends with ski trips and amusement parks, Mia filled the corners of her notebooks with sketches. They weren't just doodles, they were little portraits of her father, each one a record of the ways she saw him when no one else did. One page showed him fixing Mrs. Delgado's toaster in their apartment building lobby, his brow furrowed but patient. Another showed him bent over a storybook in the lamplight, his eyes heavy, his lips forming the words anyway because she loved the sound of them. She had even drawn him once the way she wished the world would see him, taller than his mop, stronger than the shadows he lived in, standing in a way that made invisibility impossible. Her dad never asked to see the sketches, but sometimes she'd leave them where he might find them anyway, tucked into his lunch bag, slipped under his coffee cup in the morning, hidden in the pocket of his uniform jacket. He never said much when he discovered them, just looked at her a little too long, his eyes soft in a way that made her chest ache. Once, Madame, when she was younger, she'd called him her superhero. He'd laughed, shaking his head, and said, "Superheroes don't mop floors, kiddo." But she'd held his gaze and replied, "The good ones do." He hadn't argued with her after that. There was a strength about Ethan Cole that Mia saw clearer than anyone. It wasn't in his arms or his height. It was in the way he carried grief without letting it spill onto her shoulders. It was in the way he always made sure she walked on the inside of the sidewalk, farthest from traffic. It was in the way he sat in diners, always with his back to the wall, always scanning exits, as though even in the safest places he refused to gamble with her safety. She'd learned not to ask why. She just accepted it as part of him, like the calluses on his hands or the deep, quiet hum in his voice when he said goodnight. But lately, Mia noticed something else, something heavier. The tremor in his hands after long shifts. The way he lingered outside her bedroom door some nights, as if listening for proof she was really there. The way his shoulders seemed permanently braced, like he was waiting for another blow from life he couldn't stop. She watched all of it, and she wondered how much longer he could carry it alone. To her, he wasn't invisible. He was everything. But the world had a cruel way of ignoring men like Ethan Cole, and Mia couldn't shake the thought that one day it might break him before it ever bothered to see him. So she sketched harder. She sketched him not as a janitor or a tired father, but as the man she knew him to be, anchored, unyielding, larger than his shadows. If the world wouldn't see her father for who he was, then she would draw it into existence herself. She told herself that someday someone would look at those sketches and finally understand what she had always known, that her dad wasn't just holding them together, he was holding up the world. Victor Dane understood power the way some men understood symphonies. Every note, every pause, every crescendo played exactly when he willed it. At 52, he didn't just step into a room, he bent it. Conversations quieted, postures straightened, and even silence seemed to shift toward him, like metal to a magnet. He thrived on it, the unspoken choreography of fear and admiration. He had built an empire out of ruthless precision, his reach stretching across shipping lanes, financial institutions, and political offices that owed him favors. His name wasn't just printed on contracts, it was engraved in the decisions that shaped lives far beneath his view. Magazines praised him as a visionary, a titan of industry. The photos always captured the angles he approved, chin lifted, eyes cutting like blades, a smirk that suggested he knew something no one else could. And maybe he did. The truth was, Victor Dane never learned the word enough. Every acquisition fueled another. Every conquest was only proof he was destined for more. People whispered that he was brilliant, ruthless, untouchable. What they didn't say out loud, but everyone knew, was that Victor enjoyed watching others shrink in his shadow. The tower that bore his name rose above the city like a monument to ego. Dane Global, the 20-foot steel letters declared, glaring down at the streets below. By day, it was a machine of profit and strategy. By night, it was his playground. While Ethan Cole pushed a mop across the marble floors, Victor drank champagne beneath chandeliers, holding court in the penthouse ballroom. The glass walls framed the skyline as if the city itself existed only to applaud him. Laughter came easily in those rooms. Consequences did not. Employees told stories about him in hushed tones, how he'd fired a senior executive mid-conference call for disagreeing with him, how he once replaced an entire department overnight because they failed to predict his whims, how his temper, when provoked, was as sharp and sudden as shattered glass. The official narrative painted him as decisive. The truth was closer to predatory. He didn't just want compliance, he wanted submission. He wanted people to feel small, to remember their place beneath him. Victor's charm, when he chose to wield it, was legendary. Investors fell under his spell. Politicians bent rules for him, grateful for his donations and terrified of his withdrawal. Women described him as magnetic, though many later admitted that magnetism felt more like gravity, an inexorable pull they couldn't quite escape. He moved through life insulated by wealth, guarded by lawyers, protected by the fear he cultivated in others. Scandal slid off him like rain on glass because the people who could expose him either owed him or feared him. The gala nights were Victor's favorite stage. Waiters in white gloves poured vintage wine while string quartets softened the edges of his arrogance. Celebrities, journalists, and mayors stood in circles, waiting for their chance to bask in his attention. He played them with the ease of a pianist, brushing ivory keys. Compliments when it served him, mockery when he was bored, promises delivered with enough ambiguity to keep people hungry. He had perfected the art of dangling proximity to power like bait, watching people scramble for scraps of his approval. On those nights, Ethan Cole often worked unnoticed at the edges of Victor's empire. He buffed brass railings while donors praised Victor's philanthropy. He emptied trash cans while politicians laughed too loudly at his jokes. And though their paths hadn't yet crossed directly, it was only a matter of time. Men like Victor believed they were immune to consequences, and men like Ethan carried a quiet strength that life had tried and failed to crush. Their worlds seemed too far apart to collide, but fate has a way of dragging opposites into the same orbit. Victor Dane had built his kingdom on intimidation and indulgence. He believed nothing could touch him, not the law, not the press, not the people he crushed beneath polished shoes. But one night, in the very tower that bore his name, he would cross a line so small he almost didn't notice it at first. A hand placed where it didn't belong, a moment of entitlement disguised as charm, and standing in the shadows, mop still in hand, would be the one man who refused to shrink beneath him, a man who, with a single calm question, would bring Victor's glass empire trembling toward the ground. The night began like so many others, with Ethan pushing his cart down the gleaming hallway, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and the faint scent of polish clinging to the air. His work was muscle memory by now. Wiped the glass until it looked like water, straightened chairs that would only be misaligned again by morning, empty trash bins filled with papers covered in numbers he'd never see on his paycheck. It was the same ritual every shift, and routine was what kept him steady. But that night, the tower felt different. From the penthouse above, music spilled faintly through the walls. Strings, soft and expensive, were drowned by laughter too loud, glasses clinking like bells. A gala. Ethan had worked through plenty of them. Usually they meant more cleanup, more broken crystal, more stains on carpets he wasn't paid enough to care about. He had trained himself to tune it out, to treat the noise of the powerful as background, no different than the whir of an elevator. Still, it unsettled him sometimes, the contrast of what happened upstairs and where he stood below, mopping floors, while people who never learned his name toasted fortunes that would last generations. Mia had begged to come along that evening. She said she just wanted to sketch in the break room, to listen to the hush of the building at night. She liked the rhythm of his work, the way he whistled softly under his breath, the sound steady and warm, like home. He'd hesitated, but the truth was, he liked having her near. The nights felt less hollow when she was somewhere in the building, her pencil scratching quietly as he worked. So he let her bring her sketchbook, gave her the usual reminder to stay put, and kissed the top of her head before wheeling his cart into the next corridor. For a while, everything was normal. The tower had a rhythm, a pulse Ethan knew better than anyone. But sometimes, even the most familiar patterns break. It began with a laugh, too sharp, too close. Ethan paused mid-step, the mop dripping faintly onto marble. He wasn't alone in this part of the floor. Someone had strayed from the gala upstairs. Then came the click of a door opening down the hall, the creak echoing just enough to set his instincts on edge. And then he saw her. Mia. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had wandered out of the break room, sketchbook clutched against her chest, eyes wide with the curiosity that always pulled her toward the edges of things. She looked small in the long hallway, her sneakers too loud against the polished floor. She froze when she saw the man in front of her. Victor Dane. He leaned casually against the wall, his jacket undone, a glass in his hand. His smile carried the easy arrogance of a man who had been cheered all night, who believed the world bent for him because it always had. But his eyes, sharp, glinting with something darker, locked on Mia with unsettling focus. He stepped forward, his balance just slightly off, the smell of expensive liquor wafting before him. "Lost, sweetheart?" His voice slurred just enough to sound dangerous. Mia clutched her sketchbook tighter. She didn't answer. Her silence didn't matter. Victor Dane wasn't asking. His hand moved before she could step back, landing on her shoulder with the kind of entitlement that came too easily to him. A hand that had never been told no, a hand that had no right to touch her. And just like that, the rhythm broke. For Ethan, the world narrowed to a single moment, the sound of Mia's sharp intake of breath. His chest went cold, then hot, rage and instinct colliding in a rush that carried him down the hall before thought could catch up. His boot struck the marble once, twice, then silence as he stopped just behind her. The mop handle slipped from his grip, clattering softly against the wall. Victor looked up, startled at first, then smirked, as if amused by the interruption. He didn't yet understand. He didn't yet see what stood in front of him. Ethan's eyes never left the hand on his daughter's shoulder. And when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was low, calm, steady, and heavier than any shout could ever be. "You laid a finger on her?" The words cut through the hallway like glass. Victor's smirk faltered. His drink slipped, shattering across the marble, wine bleeding like a wound across the floor, and in that silence something shifted, not just in the room but in the story of their lives. Nothing about the tower would ever be routine again. Ethan moved like a shadow that suddenly decided to reveal itself. One moment he was at the far end of the corridor, the next he was there, standing between Victor Dane and his daughter. A wall made of flesh and bone, and fury restrained so tightly it hummed in the air. He didn't bark an order. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply placed himself in the space that mattered most, his frame quiet but unyielding, and the entire hallway seemed to lean back from the force of it. His boots had clicked once, twice against the marble, and then there was only silence. Mia's sketchbook nearly slipped from her fingers. She stared at her father's back, at the way his shoulders squared, at the calm that radiated off him, even as her heart pounded like a drum in her chest. He didn't touch her, didn't turn around to reassure her, but he didn't have to. She could feel it in the way he stood. He would not let anything pass through him, not ever. Victor blinked, the kind of blink men make when the script they've relied on for decades suddenly fails them. He had expected deference, perhaps anger he could laugh off, maybe even pleading. What he hadn't expected was the question, not shouted, not snarled, delivered with the weight of stone. "You laid a finger on her?" The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. They weren't loud, yet they carried the weight of something older than law, older than power, a father's claim, sacred and immovable. The question wasn't really a question. It was a sentence, a judgment wrapped in syllables, a line carved deep into the floor. For the first time in years, Victor Dane felt his own footing slip. His smirk twitched, faltered, and for the briefest second, something like unease crept across his features. His hand, the one that had rested so casually on Mia's shoulder, retracted as though burned. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Instead, his glass tilted, slid from his fingers, and shattered on the marble. The crimson liquid spread quickly across the white floor, a slow, deliberate bloom that felt far too much like blood. The sound of it echoed, sharp and final. Mia flinched. Ethan didn't move. He didn't even glance at the mess on the floor. His eyes never left Victor's, calm, steady, burning with a fury so tightly caged it became something more terrifying than violence, certainty. Upstairs, the gala carried on in blissful ignorance. Laughter spilled down the stairwell, champagne corks popped, violins threaded melodies through rooms dripping with chandeliers and silk gowns. But in that hallway, time fractured. The party might as well have been on another planet. Here the air grew heavy, the silence thick with something unspoken but undeniable. Victor swallowed hard. He wanted to brush it off, to laugh, to reclaim the stage he never imagined losing to a janitor in work boots. But every attempt at bravado died in his throat, strangled by the weight of Ethan's stillness. It wasn't anger that unnerved him, it was the absence of it. Rage he could have matched, yelling he could have silenced with mockery, but this quiet, this measured calm, this unshakable certainty that he had crossed a line and would not walk away unchanged. It stripped him of the script that had carried him for decades. Mia's eyes darted between them. She had never seen her father like this, never seen a man command so much space without raising his voice. She understood in that moment what her sketches had never quite captured. He wasn't invisible. He was vast, a presence that filled the air, a force that could not be bought or mocked into submission. Victor finally managed a laugh, but it came too late, too thin, too hollow. The sound bounced weakly off the marble walls. He shifted his weight, tried to smirk again, but the smear of red wine on the floor betrayed him, a stain spreading outward like proof that something had already broken. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. His silence was louder than the orchestra upstairs, more damning than a room full of witnesses. And Victor, for the first time in years, understood that he wasn't in control. The man standing before him wasn't just a janitor, he was a father. And there are some lines you don't cross, not even in towers built on power and glass. Somewhere above them, the music swelled. Down here, the storm hadn't broken yet. But everyone in that hallway, Victor, Mia, and Ethan, most of all, knew it was coming. Victor's laugh cracked against the marble like glass dropped on stone, too loud, too sharp, the sound of a man desperate to patch over a moment he didn't control. "She's fine," he said quickly. waving his hand as if brushing away dust. "Just startled her, that's all." The words dripped with entitlement, coded in that familiar tone of men who had never once been told they were wrong. He straightened his jacket, trying to slip back into the skin of confidence that had carried him through decades of unchecked power. But Ethan didn't respond. He didn't tilt his head. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, the air around him steady, his gaze locked like iron on Victor's face. Silence poured into the space between them, thick and immovable. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from fear. It was deliberate, measured, a silence that forced every sound in the building, the hum of lights, the muffled gala upstairs, even Victor's uneven breath, to feel suddenly intrusive. Behind Ethan, Mia clutched her sketchbook so tightly the edges bent beneath her fingers. Her hands trembled, but when her eyes lifted to her father, she found something she had never seen in anyone else's eyes before, unshakable calm, not bravado, not rage, calm. It wrapped around her like armor. She didn't have to hear the words to know she was safe. Her father had decided it, and so it was. Victor shifted, his smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, but it wavered against the weight of that silence. He cleared his throat, tried again, his voice rising just slightly, betraying the unease he was trying so hard to bury. "Really, there's no need to make a scene." But it was too late. The scene had already been made, and he wasn't the one directing it anymore. From the corner, the security guard who had stood by earlier, eyes conveniently elsewhere when Victor's hand had landed on Mia's shoulder, swallowed hard. The Adam's apple in his throat bobbed visibly, and for the first time that night, his posture faltered. He wasn't staring at Victor anymore. His eyes flicked to Ethan, to the stillness in his frame, to the way he commanded the air without raising his voice. Shame prickled at the guard's skin. He had been paid to keep order, but order hadn't come from him. It had come from a janitor in work boots who refused to be invisible when it mattered. Victor opened his mouth once more, but the words caught. The smirk couldn't hold. The room itself seemed to lean toward Ethan, to wait with bated breath, as though daring Victor to say anything that would cross the line further, and he couldn't. For the first time in years, his words failed him. Upstairs, the music swelled, violins singing over laughter, the gala unaware that below its polished floors, something far more honest was unfolding. Power, people always said, was loud. It was speeches in boardrooms. It was laughter in penthouses. It was the sharp clink of crystal glasses. But in that hallway, power took another form. It was quiet. It was still. It was the silence that made even a man like Victor Dane stumble over his tongue. Mia's trembling slowed. Her breathing steadied. She watched her father's silence press down harder than fists, sharper than accusations. She would remember it for the rest of her life. That night when her father proved that sometimes the loudest thing in the world was the refusal to speak, the refusal to back down, the refusal to let someone rewrite what had just happened. Victor's arrogance drained by inches, leaving behind only a brittle veneer. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at the shattered glass on the floor, and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Accidents happen," he muttered, almost to himself, but everyone in that hallway knew better. Nothing about this was accidental. Ethan remained silent, the question still hanging between them like a sword suspended midair. "You laid a finger on her?" He didn't need to say it again. The silence had already done its work, and Victor Dane, a man who built towers to remind others of their smallness, found himself shrinking in the shadow of someone he thought was beneath him. By morning, the tower no longer felt like the place Ethan had worked in for years. It hummed with a new tension, the kind that slipped through glass walls and polished hallways like smoke. People spoke in hushed tones near elevators, eyes flicking sideways, voices clipped. Rumors had already taken root before most of the employees had even settled at their desks. The story spread with Victor's fingerprints all over it, carefully molded, deliberately warped. A misunderstanding, a janitor who lost his temper, a teenage girl who'd wandered into a place she didn't belong. Ethan had expected it. He knew men like Victor never truly lost. They simply rewrote the ending until the truth was unrecognizable. They didn't fight with fists. They fought with stories. And stories, when told from a tower high enough, became fact whether or not they had any resemblance to reality. By mid-morning, the summons came, a neat little email, polite but firm, requesting his presence in human resources. Ethan washed his hands in the janitor's sink, the scent of bleach clinging to his skin as he studied his reflection. His face looked calm, too calm. But his chest burned with the memory of Mia's eyes the night before, wide and trembling, her fingers clutching her sketchbook so tightly the pages crumpled. He thought of the sound her breath had made when Victor's hand touched her shoulder, a sound no father should ever hear. The HR office was a box of glass, perched like an aquarium in the center of the floor. Inside, two representatives waited, their smiles stretched thin, their postures precise. They welcomed him in with voices rehearsed to sound warm, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. On the table lay a folder, thick with papers, and clipped neatly, as if neatness could hide the ugliness it contained. "Mr. Cole," the woman began, her tone polished to perfection, "thank you for coming in. We wanted to address the incident last night." Incident. Ethan's jaw tightened. That was the word they chose. Not assault, not misconduct, not a man's hand where it had no right to be, just an incident, as if it had been a coffee spill or a broken vase. The second representative, a man with a watch worth more than Ethan's yearly rent, slid the folder toward him. "We understand these situations can become exaggerated. Emotions run high. Misunderstandings occur. We'd like to resolve this quickly and fairly." He opened the folder, revealing a contract and a check. A number was written there, more than Ethan had seen in one place in his life. "This severance package," the woman continued, "is generous considering the circumstances. We believe it would be best for all parties if you took it and allowed everyone to move forward without further complications." Complications. Another careful word. What they really meant was silence. They wanted him gone, boxed up with the trash bags and the mop bucket, erased before his presence could stain the tower's perfect glass. Ethan didn't reach for the folder. His hand stayed folded in his lap, steady, unmoving. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting for the gratitude they expected, the relief, the quick nod of a man who knew his place. But all he could think of was Mia, sitting cross-legged on the couch the night before, trying to sketch through the tremor in her hands, her pencil smudging because her fingers couldn't hold still. Walking away wasn't an option, not this time. Not when the cost of silence would be paid in her trust, her safety, her belief that the world might protect her. If he took that check, if he disappeared quietly, what lesson would he leave her with? That money outweighed truth? That men with power could touch what wasn't theirs and buy their way out of consequence? That even her father, the one person who promised to keep her safe, could be bought? He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, his silence louder than any protest. The HR reps shifted, unsettled, as though his refusal to play the part unnerved them. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low, unshaken. "You can keep your check." The man's brows furrowed. "Mr. Cole." Ethan rose to his feet, calm as ever. "I came here to clean your floors, not to sell my daughter's dignity." His words landed like stones, flat and undeniable. The glass walls of the office reflected their faces back at them. Two corporate professionals trained to manage damage, suddenly realizing the damage wasn't his to carry. Ethan left without the folder, without the money, without the approval they wanted. He walked back into the buzzing tower with the same quiet strength he had carried all his life. And though the lies were already spreading, though Victor's story was already gaining traction, Ethan knew something they didn't. This wasn't about rumors. It wasn't about severance or silence. It was about Mia's trembling hands, about a father's vow, about a line in the marble no paycheck could erase. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole wasn't just surviving. He was standing. The meeting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper, too clean, too sterile, as if scrubbing the air could erase what had happened. Ethan sat in the hard-backed chair, shoulders squared, jaw tight, eyes steady. He had come prepared to listen to the accusations, to take the blows one by one. He had learned long ago that the powerful didn't swing fists. They wielded words sharpened into weapons, and they always cut the deepest when delivered with polite smiles. But before he could even open his mouth, Mia's voice broke through. "I need to say something." The room stilled. HR executives blinked, their hands frozen over neatly stacked papers. Victor's lawyers exchanged quick glances, irritation flickering like static. Ethan turned toward his daughter, surprise etching across his features, but she was already moving. She climbed into the chair beside him, small in her oversized hoodie, her sneakers dangling above the floor, her sketchbook clutched tight against her chest like a shield. She placed it gently on the glossy table, her fingers trembling but determined. With deliberate care, she opened it, the spiral binding creaking faintly in the silence. Page 1, her wide eyes drawn in soft graphite, pupils large with fear, hair falling across her face. Page 2, Victor's looming figure, his hand a dark shadow pressing down on her shoulder, towering over her in jagged lines. Page 3, her father drawn taller than life, his stance blocking her, his presence the wall she knew would not break. She turned the pages slowly, letting each image sit heavy in the air. There were no captions, no explanations. She didn't need them. The pencil strokes spoke louder than words could. Silence thickened. The HR executives shifted in their seats, suddenly uncomfortable beneath the weight of a truth they could not redact with memorandums or severance checks. A few cleared their throats. One scribbled a note as if the sound of his pen might distract from the undeniable images before him. Victor's lawyers leaned forward, their voices brittle. "These are drawings," one said. "Childish doodles, hardly admissible, hardly relevant. She's a minor, she imagines things. We cannot base company policy on sketches from a 14-year-old. The words rang hollow. Everyone in that glass box could feel it. The pictures didn't look imagined. They looked lived. They carried the urgency of someone who had seen too much and poured it onto paper because there was no other way to be heard. Ethan hadn't moved. He sat still, his gaze fixed not on the lawyers, not on HR, but on his daughter. His chest tightened as he watched her spine straighten, her chin lift. He knew how hard her hands had trembled last night, how she'd hidden in her room with her sketchbook pressed against her knees. And now, here she was, laying it bare in the very place designed to silence them. One woman, seated slightly apart from the others, stopped taking notes. She was younger than the rest, her blazer a little too big, her hair tied back too tightly. She looked at the drawings longer than the others did. Her eyes lingered, her lips pressed thin. Something in her expression softened. Recognition, maybe even pain. She had grown up with a father like Victor. She knew what it was to be dismissed, to be told what she remembered was just imagination. She knew testimony when she saw it, even when it came in pencil. "Evidence," she whispered, almost too softly for anyone to hear. But Mia did, and her small shoulders straightened even more. Victor's lawyers scoffed, muttering about relevance, but the momentum had shifted. The drawings had cracked through the polished facade of control. They weren't just pages in a sketchbook anymore. They were witness statements, etched in lead and smudged by trembling fingers, a story no boardroom spin could erase. For the first time, Mia's art wasn't an escape from the world. It was a mirror held up to it, and no one in that room could look away. Ethan placed his hand gently over hers on the table, steady and sure. His silence told her what words could not. She had done what he couldn't. She had turned truth into something undeniable. The meeting carried on, voices strained, papers shuffled, threats implied. But the power in the room had shifted. It no longer belonged to Victor's lawyers or the executives rehearsing their lines. It belonged to a girl who drew what she saw and refused to let them pretend otherwise. And Ethan, for the first time in a long time, allowed himself to believe that maybe they had more than survival. Maybe they had a fight worth winning. Not everyone who worked under Victor Dane's towering shadow admired him. Some bowed because they had no choice, their paychecks tethered to his whims. Some feared him, their careers balanced on the knife's edge of his temper. And then there were the quiet few, the ones who had been burned, discarded, humiliated, who carried their resentment in silence, waiting for the moment he finally stumbled. They weren't loud, but they were watching, and when whispers of Ethan Cole began to drift through the building, those ears sharpened. Celeste Moran had been waiting for a story like this. She wasn't the kind of journalist who sat at cocktail parties scribbling down half-truths fed to her by PR reps. She had once chased a story so far into the depths of corporate rot that it cost her her press badge and nearly her livelihood. She'd named names, and one of those names had been a man like Victor Dane. For her, truth had never been about headlines. It was about survival, the survival of the people swallowed whole by men who thought skyscrapers made them untouchable. Now she freelanced, writing under pseudonyms, publishing on platforms Victor's lawyers couldn't shut down. She had a network built in shadows, cooks, custodians, receptionists, people who saw the world from the floor up instead of the top down. They trusted her because she had never asked them to be louder than they could be. She just listened. And the things people in kitchens and closets knew, the things whispered while polishing silver or changing trash bags, were often sharper than anything filed in courtrooms. When Celeste first heard about Ethan, the janitor who had stood between Victor Dane and a trembling girl, she felt her pulse quicken. The details were fragmented, carried by rumor, a shattered glass, a question that cut sharper than a shout. A daughter who drew the truth in pencil. She didn't know the full story yet, but she knew enough. This wasn't just scandal. This was courage, raw and unpolished, the kind of courage people forgot existed until it stared them in the face. She began asking quiet questions, careful not to stir the wrong air. A dishwasher mentioned the girl's sketches. A night security guard confessed he'd seen Ethan walk out of HR with nothing but his dignity. An assistant, her hands trembling when she spoke, confirmed what no one dared write down. Victor's hand had been exactly where it should never have been. Piece by piece the story began to form, and Celeste knew it was bigger than one man in a uniform. So she arranged a meeting, not in a boardroom, not in a coffee shop where Victor's eyes lingered even in his absence, but in the simplest way possible. She slipped a business card into the slot of a vending machine in the basement where Ethan cleaned most nights. On the back, in her sharp, deliberate handwriting, she wrote, "When you're ready to be heard." Ethan found it between cans of soda and packets of chips, the white card out of place against the metal coils. He turned it over, read the words twice, and tucked it into his pocket. He didn't throw it away, but he didn't call either. He wasn't ready. He'd spent too many years teaching himself to be invisible, to survive by staying silent. Speaking up felt like stepping into crosshairs. That night, Mia sat at the kitchen table, her sketchbook open in front of her. She didn't draw the tower or Victor's looming figure this time. She drew Ethan, tall, steady, standing in front of her like he had in the hallway. When she slid the page across the table, her eyes met his. They weren't shaking anymore. They were clear, steady, insistent. She didn't have to say it out loud. Her gaze told him, "We can't stay quiet. Not this time." Ethan held the card in his hand later, long after she'd gone to bed. He read the words again, the black ink pressing against the white card like a door waiting to be opened. He wasn't ready yet, not for himself, but Mia's eyes had already decided for him, and sometimes a father doesn't speak because he wants to. Sometimes he speaks because his daughter needs him to. The night was almost over when the black car slid to the curb like a shadow with wheels. Ethan had just finished mopping the lobby, the bucket sloshing faintly as he pushed it toward the service door. Outside, the city was quiet in the way it only ever was at 3 in the morning. Streetlights buzzing, the occasional taxi gliding past, everything holding its breath before dawn. He felt the air change before he even saw the car, too still, too watchful. The rear window rolled down, smooth and deliberate. Inside sat a man who didn't belong on a sidewalk at this hour. Slick hair combed so precisely it looked lacquered. A suit dark enough to swallow the light, eyes sharp but hollow, the kind that never looked at you so much as through you. Ethan recognized the type immediately. He'd seen his kind in war zones and in back alleys, the mouthpiece of men too powerful to soil their own hands. "Mr. Cole," the man said, his voice flat, professional, almost bored. "Step closer." Ethan didn't. He leaned against his mop handle instead, posture casual but unmovable. The man's lips twitched, the closest thing he had to a smile. "Let's not waste time, he continued. "Name your price. Whatever it takes to make this disappear." His tone carried the weight of someone used to transactions, used to people folding in seconds once money entered the equation. Ethan tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "I'm not selling my daughter's safety." The man's smirk widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "Everyone has a number, even janitors." Ethan let the words hang in the night for a moment before answering. His voice was calm, steady, the same way it had been when he'd stood in front of Victor himself. "You don't have enough zeros for me." The silence that followed was heavier than the exchange. The man blinked once, slowly, as though cataloging Ethan's refusal, filing it neatly under uncooperative. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply nodded, almost like respect, though it carried no warmth. Then he tapped the driver's seat. The car door slammed shut. The engine roared to life, low and guttural, before the vehicle slid back into the darkness of the street, its red taillights shrinking into nothing. Ethan stayed where he was, leaning against the mop handle, the faint scent of bleach clinging to his hands. On the surface, nothing had changed. The lobby floor still gleamed. The night was still quiet. But inside, he knew the line had shifted. He wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. He was a problem. And in Victor Dane's world, problems didn't stay breathing long. Ethan finished his shift in silence, the echo of the car door still in his head. He didn't tell Mia when he got home, didn't let her see the shadow that lingered across his face. He let her chatter about her sketches, let her laugh about how the neighbor's dog barked at the mailman again, let her curl up on the couch beside him as if nothing had changed. He smiled, nodded, even laughed with her, but his mind replayed the conversation in the street. He'd been underestimated before, written off, ignored. But this was different. This was targeted. Victor's empire didn't play games. It eliminated obstacles. Ethan had felt the quiet warning in the man's voice, the assurance that refusal was not a permanent state. Money had been the first offer. The next would not be so polite. He lay awake long after Mia had drifted to sleep, staring at the ceiling of their small apartment. His instincts, honed years ago in places far from here, whispered to him in the dark. This wasn't over. Not by a long stretch. He'd drawn a line in the sand with his silence and his words, and now Victor's men would decide how to answer. But as he listened to Mia's steady breathing from the next room, Ethan made a promise to himself as binding as any vow. He had fought for strangers once, bled for people he didn't even know. For his daughter, he would fight harder. Whatever storm Victor Dane thought he could unleash, Ethan would stand in its path, quiet, steady, unmoved. Because some men could be bought, some men bent, some men broke. But Ethan Cole had already lost too much to let fear claim what he had left. And Victor Dane was about to learn that not every problem could be erased with a checkbook. Some problems stared back at you, unflinching, and refused to disappear. The apartment was quiet in the way only late hours could make it. Shadows stretched long across the walls, the hum of the fridge steady in the background, and the faint city noise filtered down to a distant hush. Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, the light off, a cup of untouched coffee cooling in front of him. Mia was asleep in the next room, her soft breathing drifting faintly through the cracked door. It should have comforted him, that sound, but tonight it only reminded him of how much he had to lose. He pressed his palms flat on the table, staring at the grooves in the old wood. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of years he had buried had suddenly clawed its way back to the surface. His mind slipped where it often did in the stillness, back to another life, another name, Sergeant Ethan Cole. He remembered the sand first, the way it scorched everything, clung to his skin, filled his lungs, blurred the horizon. Then the sounds, gunfire that cracked the sky in half, the whistle of mortars, the barked orders that could save or end lives in a single breath. He had carried men bleeding out of the dust, their eyes wide, their grips desperate. Some lived, some didn't. And every single one carved themselves into him, leaving scars far deeper than the one that ran along his forearm. He traced that scar now, his thumb brushing the raised line like a familiar path. He remembered when he got it, an ambush on a convoy, shrapnel tearing through metal and skin. He hadn't thought about the pain, only about covering the men pinned down beside him, about dragging them behind a broken wall, until reinforcements came. It wasn't bravery, it was duty. And duty didn't end when the uniform came off. But war had followed him home in other ways. It lived in his nightmares, in the way he always faced the door at restaurants, in the tremor that ran through his hands when the world got too quiet. His wife used to notice it, though she never said much. She'd simply place her hand over his and hum softly, grounding him. When she was gone, the silence grew sharper, more jagged. Mia became his anchor, though he feared every day she'd see too much of the man the war had left behind. He'd sworn never to fight again, never to let her glimpse the violence still curled in his bones. Tonight, though, the past felt closer. The black car, the man's words, the offer wrapped in threat. He knew what came next. He'd seen it play out too many times in too many forms. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but the battlefield had found him again, disguised in suits and marble towers. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to teach Mia that survival always came with blood and bruises. But he also knew something the war had taught him, something Victor Dane's men didn't understand. Fighting wasn't always about fists or bullets or fire. Sometimes it was about refusing to move when someone tried to push you down. Sometimes it was about standing in the middle of the storm and letting it break itself against you. He opened his eyes, staring into the dark, the scar on his arm still beneath his hand. He didn't have to fight to win. He just had to stand, and sometimes standing was louder than war. From the other room, Mia stirred, murmured something in her sleep, then settled again. Ethan listened, his chest easing just slightly. That was why he had to hold the line, not for pride, not for revenge, but for her. The world had already taken too much from her, her mother, her innocence, her peace. He would not let it take her safety, her belief in him. The ghosts of his past whispered in the silence, reminding him of battles lost and men buried. But as he sat there in the dark, Ethan Cole knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't done. Not yet. And when Victor Dane came for him again, he would find not a broken janitor, but a man who had already walked through fire and learned how to remain standing when everything else burned. The cafe was nearly empty, the kind of place where conversations were meant to fade into the hum of the espresso machine and the low hiss of steaming milk. Ethan sat by the window, shoulders hunched, his work jacket folded across the chair beside him. His coffee had long gone lukewarm, but he stirred it anyway, watching the swirl of cream like it might tell him something he didn't already know. He wasn't here to linger, just a quick stop before heading home. But when the bell over the door chimed, he felt the shift in the air before he even looked up. Celeste Moran moved with the ease of someone who knew how to enter unnoticed and yet still command the room. She spotted him instantly, cutting across the floor with purpose, and before Ethan could gather his things, she slid into the seat opposite him. Her coat was worn, her notebook tucked under one arm, her pen already in hand. She didn't wait for pleasantries. "You don't want a spotlight," she said, her voice low, measured. "I get it. You've built your life on being unseen, but men like Victor thrive in shadows. If you stay silent, he wins twice, once for what he did and once for what he made you bury." Ethan didn't look at her. He kept stirring his coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. He'd spent years perfecting silence, and he wasn't about to abandon it because a journalist thought she understood. He had Mia to think of. Their lives were fragile enough without headlines tearing through them. Celeste studied him, her gaze sharp, but not unkind. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. Without a word, she slid it across the table toward him. Ethan's hand stilled, the spoon frozen mid-stir. He looked down. The photo was grainy, taken at another gala, another night of champagne and chandeliers. Victor Dane stood at the center, his arm draped over the shoulders of a young woman in a dress too tight, her smile strained. His hand rested lower than it should have, fingers pressing against fabric like he owned it. The expression on her face was the same Ethan had seen on Mia's, startled, cornered, silent. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's not just Mia," Celeste whispered, her voice gentler now. "It never was." The cafe seemed to fade around him. The low chatter, the hiss of steam, even the clatter of cups, all dimmed until there was only the photo and the thrum of his pulse in his ears. He saw the arrogance in Victor's eyes, the same arrogance that had shattered glass on marble floors, the same entitlement that had reached for his daughter without a second thought. And now, here it was again, caught in a single, frozen frame. Celeste leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "There are others. Dozens, maybe more. Women who won't speak because they're afraid, because they've seen what happens to people who challenge men like him, but you—" She tapped the photo lightly with her pen. "You stood up. You didn't blink. That matters. People need to see it." Ethan finally lifted his gaze from the photo, meeting hers for the first time. Her eyes were steady, searching, not for spectacle, but for truth. He saw the exhaustion in them, the toll of years spent fighting battles she hadn't been allowed to win. She wasn't chasing a headline. She was chasing a reckoning. Still, he hesitated. He glanced at the window beside him, at the reflection of a tired man with lines etched deep into his face, a man who'd spent too long trying to stay invisible. Maybe invisibility had been his shield. Maybe it had kept Mia safe, kept him from losing more than he already had. But as he looked at the photo again, at the way Victor's hand claimed what wasn't his, the thought pressed harder against him. Maybe silence wasn't safety anymore. Maybe it was surrender. He let out a slow breath, setting the spoon down at last. The coffee had gone cold. He didn't care. He placed his hand over the photo, not to hide it, but to hold it in place. "You think the world will listen to a janitor?" he asked quietly. Celeste's answer was immediate. Not to a janitor, to a father. Ethan looked at her, then at the reflection in the glass once more. For years he had made peace with being unseen, but maybe it was time the world saw him after all. The ballroom had been staged for spectacle, the kind Victor Dane knew how to orchestrate better than anyone. White tablecloths stretched in perfect symmetry, spotlights framed the podium, and rows of cameras stood at attention like soldiers awaiting command. Shareholders sat forward in their seats, rehearsed applause at the ready. The quarterly update was never about numbers. They were already written in the reports. It was about performance, about Victor standing tall, smiling that signature smile, reminding everyone that he wasn't just a businessman. He was inevitability. He appeared on cue, flanked by assistants in crisp suits, his stride carrying the assurance of a man who believed the world was permanently tilted in his favor. The press table murmured as flashbulbs cracked, capturing his every movement. He adjusted his tie, nodded to the moderator, and let his smirk grow wide under the lights. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as silk poured over steel, "another quarter of unparalleled success. Dane Global has not only met expectations, we have exceeded them again. Applause, right on schedule. The kind of clapping that came from wallets, not hearts. Victor spread his arms wide, as though inviting the room to bask in his triumph. To the untrained eye, he was untouchable. But Celeste had worked her way into the press table, and Ethan, hair combed, jacket borrowed, eyes steady, sat in the back row, unnoticed for now. Celeste's whisper had been clear that morning. He thrives because no one interrupts his story. Change the story. Ethan had barely touched his coffee, his silence stretching longer than usual. And if he buries us after? She had met his gaze, unwavering. Then at least he doesn't bury the truth alone. Now, as Victor moved seamlessly into talking points about expansion and philanthropy, Ethan rose from his seat. No rush, no theatrics, just steady movement, the way a man stands when he knows he can't sit anymore. His boot scuffed softly against the carpet, but the sound carried farther than it should have in the hush between Victor's sentences. At first, no one noticed. Cameras kept clicking, pens kept scratching. But when Ethan stopped, tall and immovable in the back of the room, his voice cut through the air, calm and terrifying in its stillness. "You laid a finger on my daughter." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They threaded through the microphones, carried by the silence that followed. Heads turned. The room stilled. Gasps broke like glass. Reporters twisted in their chairs. Cameras swiveled. Flashes burst in frantic succession. The line that had been so carefully rehearsed, Victor's stage, Victor's story, Victor's control, fractured in an instant. Victor's smirk faltered, just barely, but enough. He tried to laugh it off, his tongue forming the beginnings of a dismissal, but the crack had already spread. The mask he'd worn for decades, polished and unshakable, had split under the weight of one sentence spoken in a janitor's voice. "Excuse me?" Victor said finally, his tone pitching high, brittle, where it should have been smooth. But the press smelled blood. Questions exploded from every direction. What does he mean? Is there an allegation? Mr. Dane, who is this man? What happened to his daughter? The room was no longer his stage. It was a storm, and he was floundering at its center. Victor raised his hands, tried to reclaim the rhythm. This is absurd. Flashbulbs blinded. Reporters pushed forward, their voices sharpening. Is this true? Is there evidence? Has Dane Global covered up misconduct? The words piled on top of one another until Victor's protests drowned under them. Ethan didn't move. He stood still, the way he had in that hallway with Mia behind him, letting silence do the cutting. His presence alone was enough. He didn't need to argue, didn't need to explain. He had spoken the line that mattered, and the world had heard it. Victor Dane, for the first time in his empire's long history, looked small on his own stage. Powerful men never fell without clawing on the way down. Victor Dane had built his life on image, and image was the battlefield he knew best. By dawn, Ethan Cole's name was already poisoned. The story twisted so tightly it looked nothing like the truth. A disgruntled employee, a violent veteran, a man with a temper who had lashed out at his betters. Headlines cropped up in places Ethan had never expected to see his own name. Blogs, tabloids, even morning shows, each one parroting Victor's carefully manufactured script. There were fake police reports, conjured from thin air but stamped with official seals. Grainy security footage edited to show Ethan stepping forward toward Victor with a clenched jaw, the audio muted, the moment stripped of context until it looked like aggression instead of defense. Even his past debts, long resolved, were dragged out of the grave and paraded as evidence of instability. To the outside world, Victor Dane was no longer the man under question. Ethan was. At the apartment, the retaliation grew uglier. Anonymous notes slipped under the door, some scribbled in sharp, angry ink, "Stay silent or stay buried." Others printed in block letters, colder, detached. "She deserves better than you." Their mailbox, once a place of routine bills and flyers, became a vessel of cruelty. One morning Mia opened it and gasped. Inside her sketches, pages she hadn't shown anyone but her father, had been torn to shreds and stuffed through the slot, graphite smudges smeared like ash across the paper. She stood frozen, her small hands trembling as she held the scraps. Ethan took them gently, piecing them together on the kitchen table as if he could restore them. The sight of his own face, drawn by his daughter and then shredded by someone's deliberate malice, nearly undid him. He wanted to rage, to shout, to march into Victor's tower and break every lie with his bare hands. But he looked at Mia, her eyes wide and wet, and forced himself to stay still. "He's trying to scare us," Ethan told her, his voice calm even though his chest felt like it might split open. "But bullies don't scare easy when people are watching." She nodded, but the tears still slid down her cheeks. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, pressing his chin to the crown of her head. She shook against him, her sobs muffled in his shirt. His hands trembled as he stroked her hair, the cracks in his armor widening, but he held on with everything he had. Because if he broke in front of her, the fire Victor had lit would burn her too. The days that followed blurred into survival. Neighbors grew cold. Parents at Mia's school whispered when he dropped her off, their eyes darting away when he caught them looking. At night, shadows lingered too long outside their building. Once, Ethan thought he saw the glint of a camera flash from across the street. Celeste called often, her voice taut with fury. "He's bleeding you dry," she said. "This is what he does. He smothers you in lies until you can't breathe." Ethan only answered, "Then we keep breathing." But the cost was real. Every threat, every smear, every headline chipped at their sense of safety. The apartment, once their refuge, felt less like a home and more like a bunker. Still, Mia drew. Even after her sketches had been shredded, she took out a new notebook and filled its pages again. One evening she slid a picture toward him, a small figure standing beneath a storm cloud, holding an umbrella big enough for two. Beneath it, she'd written in uneven letters, "We don't move." Ethan stared at it for a long time, his throat tight, his hands trembling as he traced the pencil lines. She had captured him better than he could ever capture himself. Not a fighter, not a soldier, but a man who refused to step aside, no matter how heavy the rain. They had lit a fire, that much was true. The only question was whether it would consume them, or Victor Dane's empire built on silence. Ethan pressed his palm flat against the drawing, his jaw set. For Mia, for every child who had been told to stay quiet, he prayed the flames would burn the right man down. The night was quiet in the apartment, but Mia couldn't sleep. She sat cross-legged on her bed with her sketchbook open, the lamp by her side casting a warm circle of light that made the graphite marks on the page look sharper, darker. She flipped through the drawings again, the wide-eyed girl staring at a looming figure, the hand pressed down where it never belonged, the father who had stepped into the frame and turned the story. Each picture was a memory she couldn't shake, each one a truth that had been dismissed as exaggeration, distortion, childish doodles. But to her they weren't drawings, they were proof. Her father's voice echoed in her head, steady and calm, telling her they would endure, that bullies didn't scare easy when people were watching. But what if no one was watching? What if the lies swallowed them whole before anyone even knew the truth existed? She thought of the shredded sketches in their mailbox, of the notes slipped under their door, of the way people at school whispered about her father when they thought she couldn't hear. And she thought of Victor Dane, smiling in photographs, his empire untouchable, while her father bore the weight of being called a liar. Her hands shook as she picked up her phone. She had never been one to broadcast her life. Her world existed in sketches, not status updates. But tonight, her silence felt heavier than her voice ever could. Slowly, deliberately, she began photographing each page of her sketchbook. Her drawings lined up on the screen like chapters of a story no one had wanted told. She opened her social media account and started typing, her words small and simple, but raw. "This is what my dad saw. This is what I felt." This is why silence isn't safety. She hit post before she could second-guess herself. At first, nothing happened. The blue glow of her phone screen stared back at her, quiet and unimpressed. She placed it down beside her and tried to breathe, her stomach in knots. But then a notification pinged. One like, then another, a comment. She's braver than the adults in the room. Another, we believe you. Then more, flooding in faster than she could read. Stand tall, kid. The truth is louder than their lies. Your dad is a hero, and so are you. Within an hour, the post had spread beyond her circle of classmates. Strangers she had never met shared it, their words lifting her drawings like wings. By midnight, it was across the city. Screens glowed in kitchens and offices, in dorm rooms and subway cars, showing page after page of her truth. Her pencil had done what headlines hadn't managed. It had cut through the noise. Ethan found her still awake, the glow of her phone lighting her face, tears streaking her cheeks not from fear this time, but from something else release, maybe even hope. He sat on the edge of her bed, glanced at the screen, and froze. Her drawings, her words, all of it laid bare for the world. "Mia," he whispered, his voice breaking. She looked up at him, her chin trembling, but her eyes steady. "They have to know, Dad. If we stay quiet, he wins." Ethan swallowed hard. His instinct was to shield her, to protect her from the storm she had just stepped into. But as he looked at her, at the steel in her 14-year-old eyes, he realized she wasn't breaking. She was building. Her courage wasn't reckless. It was necessary. She had chosen to step into the light, and the world was already listening. Down the street, in Dane Global's glass tower, Victor's PR team scrambled. Statements were drafted, denials rehearsed, hashtags pushed into the digital tide. But none of it mattered. The narrative had slipped from their hands. A girl's pencil had become a sword, and no amount of polish could dull its edge. Ethan wrapped his arms around his daughter, holding her close. Her phone buzzed and buzzed with notifications, each one another stranger standing with them, another voice added to theirs. His hand shook as he held her, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from awe, because it hadn't been him who turned the tide. It was Mia, and her truth was already louder than Victor Dane's empire of lies. For years, Victor Dane had thrived on the illusion of invincibility. He cultivated it in every room he entered, in every headline he bought, in every deal where fear weighed more than trust. But empires built on intimidation only looked solid until someone tapped the glass. Now the fractures were spreading faster than he could seal them. Shareholders had never lost sleep over morality. They didn't care whose backs were broken so long as the numbers rose. But they cared deeply about perception, and perception had turned against him. The story of Ethan Cole's calm question had bled into every newspaper, every talk show, every feed that mattered. It wasn't just about a janitor and his daughter anymore. It was about what that story revealed. Sponsors who once toasted Victor's brilliance pulled support with icy statements. Politicians who had taken his calls at midnight now refused to return them. Inside the tower, whispers grew louder. Employees who once cowered under Victor's gaze began trading stories in break rooms, their voices no longer confined to hushed corners. Tales of intimidation, harassment, sudden firings without cause, they surfaced like cracks in a pane of glass. Each one small on its own, but together they spiderwebbed across the empire he had spent decades convincing the world was indestructible. The board convened emergency meetings, their polished calm cracking under the pressure of plummeting stock prices. They spoke in careful tones about public trust and stability. But everyone in the room understood what was at stake. They didn't want Victor's head for justice. They wanted it for survival. Victor roared. He slammed fists against tables, hurled glasses against walls until shards glittered across marble like confetti from a war he was losing. He demanded loyalty, threatened lawsuits, promised vengeance. His voice thundered through the tower, but the thunder no longer inspired awe. It only exposed his desperation. His empire had fed off fear, but fear was fragile once people stopped believing it was permanent. And everywhere he turned, He saw it. That sentence. 4 words that had slipped from a janitor's lips with terrifying calm. You laid a finger on her? It echoed in every article, every interview, every late-night comedian's monologue. The line clung to him like a stain that no amount of denial could scrub away. It wasn't just accusation, it was indictment, carried on the stillness of a man who had nothing left to lose. For the first time in years, Victor found himself cornered, not by prosecutors, not by rivals, but by the one thing he couldn't bribe or intimidate into silence: truth, multiplied through the voices of people who had waited too long to be heard. His empire wasn't collapsing because of outside attack. It was rotting from within, the foundations hollowed out by secrets finally dragged into the light. Ethan didn't see any of this firsthand. He was home with Mia, piecing their lives together night by night, holding on to the quiet victories of survival. But even from a distance, he felt the shift. He saw it in the headlines Celeste slid across diner tables, in the way neighbors who once looked away now nodded in quiet solidarity. The tide was turning, not because he shouted louder than Victor, but because he had refused to bow, refused to bend, refused to sell the truth for silence. Victor Dane had spent decades convincing the world he was untouchable. But glass, no matter how thick, always breaks the same way, slow at first, then all at once, and the cracks were spreading faster than he could cover them. The day Victor Dane finally fell didn't look like the dramas he had so often orchestrated. There were no grand speeches, no cameras flashing as he emerged victorious from yet another battle. It came quietly, with the scrape of a chair and the whisper of papers sliding across a polished mahogany table. Resignation, not offered, but demanded. His own board, the men and women who had once nodded at every word, now sat across from him with folded arms and lowered eyes. They weren't courageous, they were cornered. Stock had dropped, sponsors had fled, whispers had become shouts, and the empire built on Dane's name was bleeding too fast for anyone to pretend it was still indestructible. Victor tried to spin it, of course. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, voice smooth, announcing it as a strategic retreat, a chance to focus on new ventures. But even as he spoke, the words landed flat. He could command a room, but he couldn't command the truth that clung to him like smoke. Everyone knew. The janitor's calm question, 4 words delivered like a verdict, had followed him into every corner of his life. You laid a finger on her? It rang louder than any denial, echoed longer than any prepared statement. When he left the tower that bore his name, it was through a side door, not the grand lobby. No cameras waited, no applause followed, just the soft shuffle of shoes on marble and the hollow silence of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. Victor Dane, who had built walls of glass and filled them with power, now walked through them as though they were cages he could no longer unlock. Ethan heard about it not from headlines, but from Celeste, her voice low over the phone. "It's done," she said simply. "He's out." He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. The boardroom politics, the financial maneuvers, the frantic spin, they were noise. What mattered was that the man who had reached for his daughter had finally been stripped of the stage that had protected him for too long. But Ethan didn't celebrate. He didn't raise a glass or shout in victory. That wasn't who he was, and this wasn't a victory to savor. It was survival, and survival carried weight. He stood at the threshold of the tower one last time, Mia's hand warm and small in his own. He looked up at the letters etched high above, D. N-E-G-L-O-B-A-L, bold and gleaming, and for the first time they looked hollow. Mia squeezed his hand, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. She had drawn it the night before, her father and her, walking out of a building with broken glass at their feet but sunlight spilling around them. She had written one word under it, in her looping, uneven handwriting: proof. Ethan nodded once, a gesture more to himself than anyone else. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. He just needed this moment. The quiet walk out of the place where he had spent years unseen, wiping floors no one thanked him for, carrying burdens no one noticed. He wasn't invisible anymore, not to her, not to himself, and not to the empire that had tried to crush them. They stepped out into the cold air, the city moving around them, indifferent and alive. For the world, Victor Dane's fall was a headline, a ripple in markets, a piece of gossip, traded in high-rise bars. For Ethan and Mia, it was something else entirely. It was the end of a shadow that had loomed too large. It was proof that silence could be broken, that dignity could stand taller than glass towers, that survivors could outlast the giants who thought they owned the world. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply tightened his grip on Mia's hand, felt the strength of her fingers laced into his, and walked forward. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were survivors, witnesses, proof. Weeks passed, and the glass tower that once bore Victor Dane's shadow learned a new rhythm. Different faces moved through the boardrooms now. Different voices issued commands. Policies were drafted. Codes of conduct hung on walls. Words like accountability and transparency passed around like fresh currency. But Ethan never went back. He had walked out with Mia that day, her hand in his, and he knew there was nothing left for him within those marble floors and mirrored walls. His time there was finished, not in defeat, but in closure. Instead, he found himself in a place that felt more honest, more human, a small community center tucked between a laundromat and a bakery, where the walls didn't shine with glass, but with stories. Stories Mia had drawn, pinned up in bold rows, her pencil lines expanded into murals of courage. Children came and stared, their fingers tracing the outlines of her images, the wide-eyed girl, the looming shadow, the father who stood in the gap. To them it wasn't just art. It was a reminder that truth could take shape, even in graphite. Ethan began teaching there in the evenings. Not lessons in violence, but in presence. Self-defense classes where he told kids that strength didn't always mean striking back. Sometimes it meant learning how to breathe steady, how to plant your feet, how to face what scared you without folding. His own hands carried scars, but he used them not to fight, but to show others how not to be broken. Parents watched from the doorways, quiet gratitude in their eyes, as their children stood taller than they had the week before. Mia painted in the corner, her sketches no longer heavy with fear, but blooming with color. Bright blues, hopeful yellows, strokes of green that stretched like new growth across paper. She no longer drew just what frightened her. She drew what she dreamed. A girl standing beneath a wide sky, a father whose shadow looked less like armor and more like home. Laughter floated through the room now, hers blending with others, and Ethan carried it with him like music he'd thought he'd lost. One evening, Celeste appeared in the doorway, her notebook tucked under her arm. She watched him guide a boy through a simple stance, correcting posture with the gentlest of touches, his voice steady, reassuring. When the class ended, she stepped forward, her eyes bright with something between pride and awe. "You realize you changed more than one life, right?" she asked. Ethan shook his head, wiping his palms on a towel. "I just protected my daughter." Celeste smiled, the kind of smile that carried weight. "Sometimes that's how revolutions start." He didn't answer, but the words lingered, weaving themselves into the quiet hum of the room. Mia looked up from her sketchbook, her cheeks smudged faintly with color. "Dad," she said softly, "can you stay just like this forever?" Ethan crossed the room and wrapped an arm around her, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. "Forever," he said, and he meant it. The world outside still churned with noise, new headlines, new scandals, new giants clawing for towers of their own. But in that room, in the quiet that stretched between pencil strokes and steady breath, there was peace. They didn't need applause. They didn't need the world's permission. They had each other, and for the first time in too many years, they felt at home. If this story moved you even a little, take a moment to share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what part spoke to you most. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next story of quiet strength, hope, and courage.